This episode of Trifles is brought to you by listeners like you, who support us on Patreon and Substack. To learn more, go to patreon.com/trifles or trifles.substack.com. Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, the problem was final, the house was empty, and his bow was last, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
You know the plots, but what about the minutiae? Why would the Pope engage Sherlock Holmes' services? Why did he receive the Legion of Honor from France? And why would he refuse a knighthood?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Bert Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 422, Baritsu. Hello and welcome to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast where we get into the details in the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Bert Wolder.
And Bert, I hope you have a good grip on this topic.
Not only that, I've got my rubber-soled shoes, and I'm actually standing on the wall. So I've got a great grip.
Well, just remember that with great power comes great responsibility.
Not to fall. That's my responsibility.
Hang on there. Well, this is an episode that is, I guess, a long time in coming. This is a topic that we probably should have knocked out in the first season because it is one of the more commented upon, well, I don't know if we'll call it an error, but a trifle in the Sherlock Holmes stories. The martial art that Sherlock Holmes claims to have taken in against Professor Moriarty on their final showdown. It, of course, happened in the final problem, but was not described to us and to Watson until the empty house. And that timeline is important, as you are about to hear. A couple of things to remind you about. First of all, you can support the show by going to Patreon or Substack, whichever works for you, and supporting us for as little as $1 a month. Your contributions help us to do the research, keep the lights on around here, and generally be in an affable and jolly mood. Because nobody wants grumpy hosts on a podcast like this.
Too late.
I hope you're getting your money's worth. And you can do that at patreon.com/trifles or trifles.substack.com. The other thing is that all of our contributors at whatever level, you are automatically entered to win a back issue of the Baker Street Journal. At the end of every month, we do a drawing from all of our contributors and choose someone at random, and we give you a back issue. And that is happening in this episode, so stay tuned at the very end for that drawing. Okay, we're going to talk about Baritsu, but first of all, we should just clear this up. There is some confusion with respect to what it's even called. Where does the confusion lie, Bert?
In the name Baritsu, and in the reference, Watson's reference, as he reports what Sherlock Holmes told him after he returned, surprisingly, and he explains what he's been doing. He explains the true happenings of that critical moment at Reichenbach, when Moriarty, but not Holmes, fell to his doom. He says, Holmes says, I have some knowledge, however, of Baritsu, or the Japanese system of wrestling, which has more than once been very useful to me. Baritsu. Well, that's a very puzzling name because it's not as such traceable to anything. However, Baritsu is. And it's also uncomfortably similar to the word jujitsu. So that's been, people have sort of, raised their eyebrows and said, what's all this about?
And of course, with this knowledge of this art of self-defense, it is a martial art, an art of self-defense. It comes from the East, specifically Japan. And obviously, there were a number of people who were living in Japan who originated in England. They came back and they brought the knowledge of these arts with them. And we, of course, are introduced to the concept publicly, not only by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle in 1903, which I believe is when The Empty House is published, but we had an introduction, over the course of around 1898, 1899, by a gentleman by the name of Edward William, known to himself as E.W., Barton Wright. Who was E.W. Barton Wright?
He was, in 1898, he was an English engineer who had spent the prior 3 years living in Japan. And he comes back to England and announces, I have formed a new art of self-defense. And what he says is, I've combined the best elements of a range of different fighting styles into a unified whole, which, he says, I have named Baritsu. He had studied a whole bunch of things. He'd studied boxing and wrestling and fencing and the use of the stiletto, which I take it was not 5-inch heels at the time, but was more likely a very thin and deadly blade. Although, who knows, he could have combined the two and had very sharp 5-inch heels. But he was, and he tested his skills by engaging the sorts of people who would attack Sherlock Holmes. Street fighters. And so he defines all this as Baritsu. He claims that he's the one who named it, and he defines it as meaning self-defense in all of its forms. And it's a blend of his own surname, because he was Barton-Wright, Bartwright, Edward William Barton Wright. And so he takes Barton, Baritsu, and combines it with a bit of jujitsu. He takes Barton bar and then a bit of Itsu. He takes the Itsu out of jujitsu, and there you are. And he writes about it in a series of articles that ran between 1899, now note the date, 1899, which is obviously later than 1893, and 1901 in Pearson's Magazine.
Yeah, and that's the curiosity here. We have Sherlock Holmes, who had this duel to the death with Professor Moriarty at the Reichenbach Falls in May of 1893. And yet, as you say, Barton Wright didn't publicize this invented martial art until 1899. So how can it be the case that Sherlock Holmes knew about this bit of martial art? And we should note that in introducing Baritsu to the world, Barton Wright combined a few different elements of different martial arts from Japan. It was largely drawn from the Shinden Fudu Ryu Jujitsu of Terajima Kunichiro and Kokodan Judo. And as it became established in London, it then expanded. And it had other styles associated with it, such as boxing, stick fighting, etc. So it became an anglicized version of this combination of Japanese martial arts.
Interesting.
And when you think about it, you think about the types of personal combat, at least for sport, that we see today. Of course, at the Olympic level, we have taekwondo, karate, etc. But on the commercial side, with oh goodness, what is it? I'm not talking about the WWE, but at least with kickboxing and other types of personal combat like that, we see a combination of martial arts and boxing, and it gets quite violent at a certain point. So this idea of combining different elements from different martial arts, different sports, etc., like judo and jujitsu, and different secret styles of Japanese writing, along with British traditions like single stick and boxing, it's not all that unique today. We saw these origins over 100 years ago.
So here we have E.W. Barton Wright writing about this between 1899 or 1898 and 1901. And oddly enough, you mentioned this at the outset. It's a big topic, Baritsu. It always strikes people who read the cases of Sherlock Holmes, but we haven't covered it. Well, it's also been lightly covered in the Baker Street Journal. There was one major article in 1958 in the Christmas Annual, which we've been talking about in prior Trifles episodes. And there's a charming little thing here. The article was written by a fellow named Ralph Judson, who was a barrister and a member of the Sherlock Holmes Society of London. And in his way, Judson discovers a lot of this in 1958, long before the availability of Wikipedia, friends. He discovers all of this stuff, and he also has dug into Pearson's Magazine, these articles in Pearson's Magazine. And so he writes about that, and he says in his article, Mr. Barton Wright approached the editor of the Pearson's Magazine, demonstrated his methods, and so impressed the editor that he was commissioned to write an article on the subject. The editor's note in the March issue of the magazine stated, "We must confess that when Mr. Barton Wright first came into this office with his credentials and claims, he is a short, good-looking man with no indications of unusual strength. We ourselves were somewhat skeptical, but a few practical tests soon showed that we were in grievous error." Can you imagine Barton Wright there in the offices of Pearson's Magazine, sort of throwing people around and saying, "Okay, come at me.
Yeah. Just the kind of excitement a publication's office needs on a sleepy Friday afternoon. Yeah. All right, we're going to have a lunch and learn, everyone. Gather around, clear the desks, move them to the sides of the wall. Yeah. And, that actually raises an interesting point, because simply writing about this, whether it's Barton Wright trying to prevail upon the good graces of the editors at Pearson Magazine, or whether it's trying to convince the readers that this is something, it only goes so far. And the two installments of his article in Pearson's happened to be illustrated. There were action photographs of some jujutsu methods that he and his Japanese partners demonstrated. So, we have this very physical interaction being illustrated, which really, I think, would give the readers of the time a better sense as to what this was all about.
Yeah, it looks quite remarkable. And I know our friend Charlie Blankstein, Cavendish Square from the Baker Street Irregulars, has investigated Bartitsu and himself knows a lot about it. But in looking at this photograph of E.W. Barton Wright, I'm impressed by his great Poirot-like mustache, which is pointing up to the ceiling. And he looks very formidable. Now, the interesting thing in Ralph Judson's article is that one of the many interesting things in 1958 is that he addresses the issue straight on. He says, well, wait a minute now. Since Sherlock Holmes professed to be an exponent of Baritsu, is it possible he was a pupil of Barton Wright and his Japanese part? Well, he says, Judson says, no. It's not possible. And that's not the case for a number of reasons. First of all, he says, The final problem was published in the Strand magazine in December of 1893, and there we learn that the event at Reichenbach took place in May 1891, so Holmes would have already been an expert in Baritsu by 1891, but that didn't make its way to England until 1899. No doubt, he says, his expertise was in jujutsu. It takes roughly 7 years to become proficient in jujutsu, so Holmes must have started his training at least 8 years previously, when he was still young, since he was born in 1854, when he was in his late 20s. Well, maybe Watson mixed all this up. I mean, after all, Barton Wright was not the first jujutsu expert to come to England. That goes back until around 1859, when the British legation was first established in Japan. So maybe Holmes came in contact with some of those people, representatives of the Japanese diplomatic corps, and found somebody to train him in self-defense. And, people never boast about this sort of thing. They never show off. And surprise, he says, plays an important role in how effective you can apply it. So if we accept the idea that Holmes was a young man, a jujutsu expert, we can begin to guess that he was the wrong person to tackle revenge or no revenge.
I was just thinking about that. Can you imagine the surprise that Professor Moriarty had when he discovered that Holmes was a martial arts expert? I mean, first of all, the pure hubris to think that as a middle-aged man, you can take on this younger man in physical combat. That's a stretch of the imagination. I mean, you're a math professor, after all. It's not like you're working out regularly. But before Moriarty locked his grip, pinning the detective's arms to his side, Holmes, having inflated to the full extent of his chest and biceps, swiftly deflated himself and slipped through his grip. Right, one fast movement, dropping on one knee, then he gripped Moriarty's heel and sent him over the abyss. That's all he needed to do. So,
yeah. And the nice thing is that Judson goes on, and says, of course, Moriarty couldn't regain his balance, but Judson says, well, from the point of view of jujutsu ethics, Sherlock Holmes was fully justified to act as he did in the defense of his life against this lunatic criminal who wanted to kill him. And so, even there, it's perfectly aligned with the ethics of this martial art. What more can we ask for?
Well, exactly. And I think that's what we would have expected out of Sherlock Holmes. He would use it honorably. He wasn't going around, jujutsu chopping people on the shoulders throughout the street, He used it as it should have been used. And Barton Wright, after he introduced this to the public in 1899, opened a series of Baritsu clubs around Greater London. And by mid-1902, it was no longer active as a martial arts school. And while we don't know exactly why the club's closure happened, it's suggested that the enrollment fees, the tuition fees, etc., were too high. And Barton Wright overestimated the willingness or the likelihood of other Londoners to share his eclectic taste in this exotic self-defense system. And, when the empty house came along, it very well could have helped resuscitate and rejuvenate the school as kind of a public relations exercise. However, Watson got the name wrong.
Oh, dear. Oh, dear.
So people were out there looking for Baritsu schools or Baritsu clubs, and there weren't any. It was the Baritsu Club.
Dear, oh, dear.
And now for that drawing that we promised you for a back issue of the Baker Street Journal. Again, this is available to anyone who supports the show at any amount. So let's pull out the big spinning prize wheel, and here we go. And it looks like it's landing on number 42. And that is Walter Taylor. Walter, congratulations. We will be getting a back issue of the Baker Street Journal out to you.
I guess after all, all these techniques of boxing and self-defense, it's only a trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You've taken my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
When I reached the ledge, I stood at bay. He drew no weapon, but rushed at me and threw his long arms round me. He knew that his game was up and was only anxious to revenge himself upon me. I have, however, some knowledge of Baritsu, or the Japanese system of wrestling, which has, on more than one occasion, been very useful to me.
My God.